So this morning, looking at ships and boats again, and Kylie and the team gave me two little passages from Mark's Gospel. And we know these really well. And so I just studied them again, got all the commentaries out from the seminary where I work, spent some time just going through the Greek, going through everything, and just looking at these stories, not because we've missed things, but it's just great to re-examine things, to look at our own lives, where we're at, what's going on. But after these two incidents that involve a boat, a storm, Jesus walking on water, Jesus asks a question. It's like the disciples fail the exam. And Mark just gleefully writes down everything. It's just like Facebook. You know, he records how the disciples have failed once again, not just once, but twice within a short period of time. But Jesus asked the question, and part of our series over the last few weeks is, what is your response to Jesus? What is our response in light of these stories? And we can easily be courageous when everything is calm. We can have principles and we can espouse them, but lo and behold, we know that life tests us, and sometimes that is publicly. And life just throws a curveball at us, and life can be really difficult. And so before we look at these two stories from Mark's Gospel, in Mark 4 and Mark 6, I just want to give you two verses that are like the bookends and give you a little bit of context. The first is Mark 4:34. And he did not speak to them without a parable, but he was explaining everything privately to his disciples. So there would be a miracle, there would be a parable, and then he would take the disciples away to the side and explain to them the meaning of what was going on. And then we turn to Mark 6:52. Okay, so it says Mark 4 there, it's Mark 6. It should be Mark 6:52. There's two verses there. And Mark 6:52 says, "For they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened." So I just wonder for us today as we go through life's experiences, are our hearts hardened or are they softened? Are we aware of what God is doing even when he doesn't answer specifically what we're praying for or what we're hoping for or what we're trusting him for? Or like the disciples, do we need to be led through another series of events so that we learn the lesson the first time? And in this story we see, in these two passages, we see Jesus with the disciples in the boat, and then the second story, he's not with them. And they go through the same sort of situation twice, just so that they can learn about who Jesus is and his authority. But it's just really interesting just to see who was it that wrote Mark's Gospel. So obviously it was Mark. But he is known as the person who deserted Paul and his cousin Barnabas on the first mission trip. Can you imagine going down in history as the guy who deserted Paul and Barnabas? And he's probably thinking, well, this trip is just not going well, not really feeling comfortable, I'm out of here. Didn't realize what Paul would go on to do and to write half of the New Testament. But he is recorded as the one who deserted. And so the lesson right at the very beginning of our message is that one mistake, one failure doesn't make you a write-off. And so Mark recorded these stories, and so where did he get most of his intel from? He got it from Peter. He was good friends with Peter. And so as you look at the book of Mark, it's the shortest gospel, and most of Mark is included in the other gospels. But Mark wrote mainly for Gentiles. There's very little reference in comparison to the other Gospels about the Old Testament. It was a book of action. It was what Jesus did, not what he said. But Mark's aim was to convince his readers of the deity of Christ. And so he records all the stories and Jesus' actions that would prove that Jesus was the Messiah, the deliverer, but that he was the Son of God, and he had God in his fullness residing in him. And so Mark records stories of Jesus' power over sickness, over demons, as Alex talked about a few weeks ago. And then we come to a whole new category, Jesus' authority over nature. And it left the disciples in these stories going, who is this person? And you're going, hang on, Jesus took you aside and explained everything to you. How come you still don't get it? But it says that their hearts were hardened and they didn't understand. But in these stories, if you go through and read them, Mark also records people's desperation. And he looks at their despair. And he contrasts faith and fear. And so often in these stories, you would have thought that Jesus' power and authority would have elicited joy, but so often it reverted back to fear. And it's just interesting to see how Mark describes the disciples. He's going, okay, well, if I'm going to go down in history as the guy who deserted Paul, I'm going to portray you in a negative light. And so in these stories, if you look at the Greek and the words that have been used to describe the disciples, it goes, they acted cowardly. These are rough fishermen in boats. They should be, in their prime, just able to deal. And so Mark records them as being cowardly. And then in the second story, he records them as being hysterical. And you can just imagine Mark going, okay, I'm going to get you guys back. I'm the deserter. And you can imagine that the disciples who later get to read this manuscript go, you recorded us as being hysterical? Surely you weren't even there. But couldn't you just kind of like choose another word? We already feel bad enough about ourselves, but you didn't have to record us as being hysterical. And so we have these two stories unfolding before us, and they're both set on the Sea of Galilee. And so just looking at the context here, for the Jews, the sea was a place of sinister power. This was where heaven and earth meet. This is where God and evil clash. So a storm comes down. They see this as something spiritual. But interestingly, if you look at early church architecture and the word nave, it describes the middle part of the church. It was designed to mirror the safety of the boat. The nave was the central part of the church where the congregation sat, from the Latin word navis, which means ship. And the parallel was that as boats are tossed in life's storms, the church was a safe place to be. And so that was early church architecture, that they were to be together in the nave, protected together from life's storms. So let's just read this first story together from Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. On that day, when evening came, he said to them, "Let us go over to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were so breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. And Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Hush, be still." And the wind died down and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? How is it that you have no faith?" And they became very much afraid and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And there's just some irony in this story. The experienced fishermen are scared, and the carpenter is asleep just calmly in the front of the boat. There are other boats set off with them. And what we see in some traditions is that some people think the gale was so fierce that some of the other boats were lost at sea. But there's not a lot of evidence to support that. But the idea here is that there was such a furious storm. It was nothing like they had ever seen. It was not an average storm. And the waves were crashing over the side. But Jesus is asleep. But the story centers on that the disciples felt that somehow Jesus was indifferent to their plight, that Jesus was unaware that they were about to lose their lives. But the ironic thing is that these are the same disciples who would then fall asleep in Gethsemane when Jesus asked them to stay awake and to pray in his time of need. And we see that he got up and he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Hush, be still." And the wind died down and it became perfectly calm. And Jesus responds and says, "Why are you so afraid? How is it that you have no faith?" And as we look at this story for Jesus, this was not just a demonstration of power. This was an opportunity. This was an epiphany where he revealed himself, his divine power. This was a divine revelation, an opportunity for him to show who he was. This was his unveiling of his glory. But as we see from the story, the disciples are again in fear. Before, they were fearful of the storm, and now they are fearful of Jesus. But it was a different type of fear. It was a reverential fear, but nonetheless, not a joy, but just, oh my goodness, who is this? And so what do we learn from this story? And this will just build into the second story. The disciples were not immune from life's incidents and pressures. And somehow I think as Christians that sometimes we think that we don't have to go through these pressures of life. But there was this feeling of the disciples that somehow Jesus was unaware of their situation and that he was indifferent. I've just been reading a book, it's a classic book. It's called The Dark Night of the Soul. It was written in the 17th century by a monk who went through great hardship. Most of it was written in prison. And he said one of the greatest pressures for us as Christians, as travelers in this life, is that this sense that God has abandoned us. And this is what he writes. Spiritual persons suffer great trials by reason not so much of the aridities which they suffer, but as of the fear which they have of being lost on the road, thinking that all spiritual blessing is over for them and that God has abandoned them since they find no help or pleasure in good things. I just think it's just a great summary of sometimes of the feelings that we have in our daily life, is that somehow God doesn't care about the situations that we're facing, or that Jesus was indifferent. And the feature of this story is faith and fear. And as I said before, the fear is replaced from a cowardly fear to a reverential fear. And Jesus asks them, where is your faith? This faith that I, as the Son of God, the Messiah, am able to help in this situation. And I just remember around 15 years ago, Catherine and I were going through a difficult time. We had to move out of Russia because Abby was just really ill, and we spent a year in England trying to get her well. And we had asked many people to pray for us, and we hadn't seen much happen. And someone just rang and just said, "Hey, Lloyd," and she rang from the other side of the world and said, "Lloyd, I see what's going on. I just want you to understand that I've just been praying for you. But I want you to understand that sometimes the boat goes down. And I want you to understand that maybe God is just saying, where is your faith in this time, even if the boat goes down? Well, this story doesn't actually talk about the boat going down. And the exegesis there is just a little bit out. But the story and that phone call really made me think, is that sometimes we just want God to intervene in all our situations and then we can have faith. But sometimes God doesn't answer in the way that we think. And we know, because we know Abby, and Abby's around, she's in Port Hedland at the moment, is that God does answer prayer, but sometimes it takes a long, long time, and he answers in different ways. But in this story, Jesus was there. His timing was different to the disciples. But he was saying, where is your faith? And then let's just come to the second story, which I think will have a little bit more to say about the situations that we're in today. So we're going to turn to Mark chapter 6, verses 45 to 52. Mark 6, 45 to 52. And immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side to BETHSAIDA, while he himself was sending the crowd away. And so there's this sense of urgency to get the disciples away. They've just had the feeding of the 5,000. And Jesus said, look, you guys get away. Go ahead. I'll meet you over there. I'll disperse the crowd. You go. And after bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. And seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and he intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost. And they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke with them and said to them, take courage, it is I, just like the I am of the Old Testament. Do not be afraid. And then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped. And they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. I'm just going to go one more verse, because this is just really interesting. When they had crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret and moored at the shore. So they were aiming for BETHSAIDA, but they ended up in Gennesaret. So in this story, in contrast to the first one, Jesus remains behind to pray. The disciples are exhausted, and Jesus says, look, I'll disperse the crowd. Just had the feeding of the 5,000, and from those bookends we know that whatever explanations that Jesus was giving to them, somehow something was not going in. And the disciples followed Jesus' command. They obeyed, but they got stuck in strong winds. But in contrast to the first story, this time their lives were not in danger. It was just hard going. They were rowing, sailing. They were trying to make it to BETHSAIDA. And Jesus sees from the mountain. He's up there praying. This is the usual place for the epiphanies. But in this time, he is praying. And somehow, supernaturally, he sees that the disciples are in a hard place. And he sees them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the 4th watch of the night, so well after midnight. Jesus comes to them, walking on the sea, and he intended to pass them. And so what does that mean? Does that mean that he saw it was difficult for them, and he thought, well, I'm not getting involved, or this is a good opportunity for you to learn something, I'm just going to sneak past? Did he want to just surprise them in BETHSAIDA and just walk past quietly on the waves? Or did he look at their rowing action and thought, oh gosh, you guys are rubbish, I'd rather walk? But But as we look at the story, as you look at the commentaries, you see just something that Jesus wanted to do in this situation. He wanted to reveal something about his divine nature, something that they hadn't understood in the first encounter in the boat. And there's two key passages. The first one is with Moses and the second one with Elijah. And so just from the Old Testament, just looking at Exodus, then Moses said, I pray you, show me your glory. And he said, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you. Similar construction to this New Testament story. And will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. And will show compassion on whom I will show compassion. That's from Exodus chapter 33, 18 to 19. And then to Elijah in the cave having a hard time. And so God says to him, and he said, go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord was passing by. So a similar construction. And here we have in this story in Mark's gospel an epiphany of God just revealing himself through his son Jesus. This was a revelation of his divinity. But we see from the disciples' response that they didn't get it. This for them was a ghost. And the story continues on, and Jesus gets in. And he says, for they all saw him and they were terrified. They were hysterical. But immediately he spoke with them and said, take courage. It is I. It's like the I am. Do not be afraid. And Jesus gets in. They still had to row to the other side. Jesus, the storm calms. And the disciples were utterly astonished. But what can we learn from the story? Because all of us have been in Sunday school, or not all of us, but most of us have. We've done all the pictures and put glittery stuff on them. And, we know this story. But what do we learn from this again? Is that we don't want toxic positivity. This like, everything's going to be okay. All things work together for God's good, And I just remember people saying that to us when our daughter was ill. And I'm just going, you know what? That really isn't helping me at the moment. And just a few weeks ago, Manchester United, if you like English Premier League, they lost 7-0. It was the worst performance in like 100 years. It was one of their worst defeats ever. And the papers said they were torn to shreds. And Erik ten Hag, coach of Manchester United, he was interviewed afterwards. And he was just saying, when Liverpool came forward for that 8th goal, we could see the fear in their eyes as they came forward. We had them exactly where we wanted them. And I'm just going, no, you just lost 7-0. That wasn't happening. How about a little bit of a reality check? And I think as we go through life's problems, sometimes these things are really significant. They shake us to the core, and there isn't a whole lot of positive things happening. And so like the disciples, our faith needs to grow, and we need to learn from the incidents in our lives. We can be obedient, but that doesn't make us immune from life's problems, because Jesus told them to get into the boat. He was the one who pushed them off. And then lo and behold, a few hours later, the disciples are going, well, Jesus, if you could see us, how come you didn't see there was going to be a strong wind? Why don't we just walk or get a donkey or something? We were being obedient, and now we're in a really difficult time. And I think for us is that sometimes God calls us to do things, but it doesn't always mean that it's going to be easy or there isn't going to be difficulties along the way. And the storm and the harsh wind, the fury comes, and the disciples, we know, have been pushed off from land and told to get going because they're exhausted. They fed the 5,000, and Jesus said, you need to get out of here. And so often the storms that hit us come when we're already really, really tired. And we just need some encouragement. And the disciples were heading to Bethsaida, but they ended up in Gennesaret. And that's even with Jesus in the boat. And we can head off sometimes, but the wind blows in a different direction. And I just think that's just a really important lesson, is that we feel God's calling to do something. We feel that we know where the destination is. But in this story, we see that Jesus is in the boat, but somehow they end up in a completely different location. But in this story, the commentators point out is that so often God reveals himself, but sometimes and often we don't recognize God. And all we see is a ghost, and we retreat in fear. So this week, I've been looking for God in different things. And just even last Sunday, someone came up to talk. I won't embarrass them. But we're just talking about something, and I just felt like God just said something through that person. It was off on the side. I thought, man, I think God just said something to me through that person. And then during the week of just looking at things, people saying things, tried not to stare too much at people when they were saying something, going, is this God or not? And then I'm going, yeah, you're just the devil. I'm out of here. But we need to look for the ways in which God reveals himself. Sometimes that is through people who come alongside us, not only to encourage, but sometimes to rebuke. Jesus watches over us in our times of trouble, even if we can't see him. And it is in the painful and the frustrating times that we learn, and in this story we see that Jesus leads his disciples to Bethsaida later. A few chapters later, we see that Jesus took the disciples. It was like he was saying to them, you're not ready to go to Bethsaida yet. We're going to go to Gennesaret. And Mark records another series of miracles. Jesus takes the disciples aside again. And so we see from chapter 6, verse 52, the disciples' hearts were hardened and they didn't learn. And they had to go through the experiences and see many of the miracles all over again. And I think in life that God sometimes brings us back to the same situation, same circumstances, so that we can learn. And sometimes these things are at a greater intensity because we have more things to learn. So I'm going through a really intense time at the moment. So Catherine's away. She's away for a month. I was supposed to be there on the ship, but because of a series of events, I had to pull out. So I feel really bad now that Catherine's, you heard, I'm flying in alone. I was supposed to be there. But just going through some study at the moment, just trying to finish off certain stage. And I'm just going, I've this feeling of panic, of frustration, of anger. And just going, I've been here before. I've been through, what didn't I learn last time? And just going, okay, let's just get some new patterns. Let's just get out of this middle of the night, this kind of feeling of panic. Switch on the light, jump out, pick up the Bible, read, pray, just discipline. And I go, okay, I've got this. I'm going to get through this. And so I just feeling, hey, I've been here before. Learn quickly and move on. And so Mark would have the reader draw the conclusion that Jesus is the one who delivers his people, and in his hands they are safe. And so in closing this morning, what is your response to Jesus? What is your response in life circumstances? Do you have faith in the person and the divinity of Christ? And there's just a great quote from this American theologian Buechner. And he says, faith in God is less apt to proceed from miracles than miracles from faith in God. And so often we say, oh, let's show us a miracle and then I'll have faith. But so often the opposite is true, is that when we have faith, God does amazing things in our